Hello, student. I'm Professor Smita Jha, and I'm here to discuss the Victorian nature and industry because we all know that Victorian age was an age of transition because of the great industrial revolution. So, how it affects the environment, the nature, the society that need to discuss. So, during the Victorian period, Britain was a powerful nation with a rich culture. It had a stable government, a growing estate, and an expanding franchise. It also controlled a large empire and it was wealthy in part because of its degree of industrialization and its imperial holdings, and in spite of the fact that three-fourths of or more of its population was working class. Late in the period, Britain began to decline as a global political and economic power relative to other major powers, particularly the United States. But this decline was not actually noticeable until after World War II. In the Victorian age, there were many changes occurred in every field in the history of Britain. There was a time, lot of rapid changes in economical, social, industrial, political, literary science, religion, and technology. Each and every field had vast changes. The impact of these changes was seen in the upper class of society or whole country. It was a time of peace, development, prosperity, and sensibility. It was the time when populations of country Britain increased because the people migrated to London from rural areas. It was a time of industrial revolution. It left a good impression on human beings. Historically, the age is remarkable for the growth of democracy following the Reform Bill of 1832, for the spread of education among all classes, for the rapid development of the art and sciences, for important mechanical inventions, and for the enormous extension of the bounds of human knowledge by the discoveries of science. The turn to nature and sciences from the industry was the direct result of the increase in the importance of education. In the early 1860s, the Royal Commission on Popular Education declared that compulsory schooling for all children was neither obtainable nor desirable, but the mindset changed, and in 1870, the Elementary Education Act finally created a national network of primary schools. A similarly provisions for secondary education was not passed until 1902. Middle and upper class families could employ tutors or send their children to private schools, but these were unregulated and varied widely in quality. Girls were worse off than boys since many people believed that domestic skills and basic literacy were all they needed to learn. Nevertheless, as the century wore on, more and more people began to accept the idea that childhood should be a protected period of education and enjoyment. However, slow education reform was incoming. It did come in 1851. Fully one-third of English children received no education at all, whereas by the end of the century, nearly 90% went to school for 7 to 8 years. During the 19th century, transformations across the sciences were taking place that were highly attentive to questions of how organisms related to one another and to their environments. In hindsight, these transformations are distinctly ecological. The Origin of a Species by Charles Darwin getting published was an important turning point of the era. Darwin's theory that plant and animal life coexisted in a web of complex relations in The Origin of a Species, published only 7 years before general morphology, established the idea that the history of a species was the history of fitness or adaptation, terms which foreground the necessity of understanding life in relational terms. Darwin was, of course, not the only individual to produce an influential theory of evolution during the 19th century. Herbert Spencer's attempt to theorize human society as a type of biological organism in which the whole was more than the sum of its parts also foregrounded codependency but extended evolutionary questions into the fields of philosophy and sociology, prefiguring 28th century Earth system sciences in which human societies are seen as part of the dynamic planetary processes. Similarly, the rise of neo Lamarckism in Britain during the latter half of the century saw Jean Baptiste de Lamarck's progressive model of evolution, in which both physical and moral characteristics acquired by an organism during its lifespan could be passed on to offspring, pose an attractive, if ultimately unsuccessful, alternative to Darwin's theory of natural selection, influencing writers from Samuel Butler to Edward Carpenter. For Haeckel, who read Darwin, Lamarck, and Spencer, as well as Victorian scientists such as T.H. Huxley and Francis Galton in the years leading up to the founding of ecology, such revolutions in the study of natural history required a framework which could attend to the biological interdependence of different entities. Haeckel's contribution to natural history has subsequently come to be seen as an important moment of synthesis in the history of biology, as the theoretical biologist Lynn Margulies has argued. Haeckel's extended, popularized, and systematically applied Darwin's idea of evolution, redrawing the boundaries between flora and fauna and ushering in a complex view of taxonomy that laid the ground for both modern ecology and evolutionary theory. The implication of discoveries in geology, evolution, and biology has long been recognized by literary critics as having profoundly influenced the Victorian imagination. More recent appraisals have begun to examine how writers were also intuitively cognizant of what was at stake in the emergent ecological picture of the world. In a recent article on Alfred Tennyson's In Memoriam A.H. at 1850, Les Oak Teller, who also contributes an article to this issue, has argued that the long poem, influenced by the geological record of deep time, mourns and commemorates extinction in a way that parallels present day questions around a species loss. What is more, literary influence did not just run in one direction. For scholars such as Ellen McDuffie and Heidi Scott, rereading Victorian science and literature enables a dialogue between 19th century ecological concern and present day anxieties around anthropogenic pollution, fossil fuel reliance, and even climate change. Such studies represent a revitalized interest in Victorian studies around presentism. That is to say, the act of bringing contemporary concern to bear on the study of 19th century text and archives. Instead of seeing presentism as an inherently distortive or anachronistic way of viewing the past, what has come to be called strategic presentism has emerged as a mode of criticism within Victorian studies that looks to establish new points of confluence and connection between earlier points in history and the present moment. Blending historicist and theoretical approaches to literary criticism, strategies, presentism looks to establish a two-way dialogue with the Victorian past and suggest that studying the Victorian period can provoke new ways of thinking about contemporary problems, including the problem of environmental degradation and climate change. Taylor argues, inviting the Victorians and Edwardian into our conversation about anthropomorphic climate change is valuable not despite the historical distance between their worldview and our own, but because of it. Tracing these connections does not collapse the past into the present, but rather illuminates the contingency of the present by way of the alterity of the past. A strategic presentation can also operate as a reminder of the way in which many of our contemporary ecological concerns were already being thought about by those in the Victorian past, albeit in greatly different terms. Lyle, for instance, in Principles of Geology, outlines deforestation, transformations in atmospheric condition, and ultimately the kind of extinction events that Tennyson mourns in memoriam. Indeed, the changeable relation between humans, other species, and other environment was a central insight of 19th century science. It would be incorrect, however, to suggest that Lyle, Darwin, or Haeckel foresaw the potential for the kind of anthropogenic climate change that we are now witnessing in the 21st century. For Lyell and other geologists of the time, human action was, in the final analysis, inconsequential when compared to the slow moving, vastly distributed geological processes that shaped the surface of the planet. It was not until several decades later, when he read George Perkins' Marx's proto-environmentalist tract Man and Nature, that Lyell was able to recognize that human could have a geomorphological influence on the earth. Yet, what is of note when rereading 19th century geology from a present day standpoint is the way in which the fundamental question being asked were not dissimilar to those that continue to be reiterated in the contemporary moment. Questions about the relationship between human agency and vast geological timescales, and by extension, the sustainability of organic life on planet Earth. Lyell's attempt to better understand these questions in the form of the geological principles he set out was pivotal for establishing the modern modes of measuring and naming environmental and climatic conditions. By his profound effect on Darwin, Lyell would go on to indirectly influence the 19th century birth of ecology. More recently, his continuing ecological legacy can be seen in the concept of Anthropocene. That we are living in the Anthropocene, an epoch in which humankind has become a global geological force in its own right. It's now a widely accepted fact, both among present day earth scientists and the public at large, even if it is still in the process of becoming a formally recognized geological period by the International Commission on Stratigraphy. The Anthropocene, a term that combines the Greek anthropos, that is man, and the geochronological unit of the epoch established by Lyell, represented in scene, is not a reflection of humankind's mastery over the planet. Rather, it recognizes how human actions have unintentionally altered geological and ecological systems at a planetary scale, from global climate temperatures to ocean acidity and the composition of soil structure. As such, while in one sense the Anthropocene intensifies the category of human as the entity responsible for so much, it also entangles human agency and intentionality within broader geological and ecological processes in such a way that decenters the human. The concept of freedom via Kant, Hegel, and Marx was at the core of 19th century ideas of progress and class struggle, is now revealed to have been bound up with an unsustainable extraction of fossil fuel. Industrialism, nonetheless, is central to the history of our emergent epoch. In his initial scientific papers on the Anthropocene, Paul Cruzen, the Nobel Prize winning geochemist, widely associated with having coined the term, argued that the Anthropocene could be traced back to a specific moment in British history. James Watt's design of the steam engine in 1784 and the dawn of what Thomas Carlyle memorably named the age of machinery. Here we find another link to Victorian ecology in the sense of the ecology of the Victorian age, the changing relations between humans, animals, and their environments during the long 19th century. The history of Britain's industrialization and urbanization plays a key role in how we understand the Anthropocene. As James Winter has argued, the sudden advent of new tools and methods for transforming and controlling nature, most of them worked out and applied first in Britain, provided the means and incentive to make large alteration to the environment and to do so almost everywhere. Such ecological alternations were visible in the invention and proliferation of steam power transport in the 1820s and 1830s, later declared by the geographer Mary Somerville in 1848 as the applications of the powers of nature to locomotion. Alternations were also visible in the new technological freedom for factory owners to depart from the water-based energy which had geographically tied them to rural riverside sites and move to coal-powered factories which could be based in cities where an abundance of cheap labor could be easily exploited. Other changes were less visually apparent but no less profound. One example is in the intensification of agricultural production, in which, as Winter has shown, developments in transportation and communication enabled sophisticated crop rotation and a mixed farming regime that relied heavily on the use of animal fertilizers. Moreover, while Winter does not mention it, such intensification in farming methods also fundamentally changed human relation with the animals, both domesticated and wild in the rural environment. Over the course of 19th century, Britain emitted 4 times as much carbon dioxide to reach a standard of living not much greater than their counterparts across the Channel in France, not only polluting the atmosphere with a hitherto unseen intensity, but establishing the blueprint for a modern fossil fuel dependent industrial society. For Timothy Morton, this matrix of scientific discovery, technological development, industrial acceleration, and imperial expansion not only bears responsibility for having produced the Anthropocene, but means that we are still inside the Victorian period in psychic, philosophical, and social space. He continues, since we are both inside industrial society and inside the Anthropocene, we are still within the Victorian period, and this is not just a fanciful notion on my part. It means that we confront gigantic entities that the Victorian also confronted. Geological time, vast network of industry, and we have the same feeling about them. While the universalizing we that Morton deploys in his framing of the Victorian Anthropocene risk falling into the rhetoric trap of suggesting that an undifferentiated concept of man is responsible for the Anthropocene, a critique some scholars have rightly made of the term's limitations. It is nonetheless a forceful assertion of the fact that modern modes of capitalism, industrialism, and globalization developed out of Victorian industrial capitalism. For Donna Haraway, the Capitalocene is also more apt description than Anthropocene, since the term draws attention to the networks of sugar, precious metals, plantations, indigenous genocide, and slaveries that propelled profound ecological changes during the preceding centuries and continue to do so in the 21st. For her, it is the globalized nature of capitalism that has enabled the planet to enter a new geological epoch. Haraway's analysis suggests the need for accounts of the Victorian Anthropocene that attend to how the importing of materials from the British Empire during the 19th century enabled the exporting of environmental risk and damage, and how foreign realms could be dangerously exploited for their natural resources and see few of the benefits. The attempts by Victorian writers and artists to represent and thereby respond to the industrialized, polluted imperial realities of the 19th century might now be seen as provided us with a cultural history of Anthropocene. This can be seen even in the works of art, such as the paintings done by J.M.W. Turner. In his paintings of industrial sprawl and expanding railways, the thickening of the atmospheric seems to be taking place on the canvas itself. From Charles Dickens to Arthur Conan Doyle, we find some of the earliest responses to the Anthropogenic climate events that were beginning to structure everyday life. Moreover, Victorian writers were not only portraying the emergent industrialized climate of Britain but attempting to imagine alternatives. Examples can be seen in Richard Jefferies' vision of a submerged England in After London, or Wild England, and the agrarian utopia of William Morris' News from Nowhere. Morris's role alongside Edward Carpenter's and Robert Blatchford's in arguing that the overthrowing of capitalism must be predicated on a less exploitative use of natural resources, and the non-human world has subsequently been characterized as the first instance of an explicitly green politics. Indeed, as Wendy Parkins argues in her article in this issue, Carpenter's interest in a sexually charged everyday ecology foreshadowed the recent development of a queer ecology that accounts for desire, sex, and gender through a non-anthropocentric lens. We might also consider how Virginia Woolf's Orlando registers the shock of the Anthropocene in the opening of the novel's Victorian section. Orlando then, for the first time, noticed a small cloud gathered behind the dome of St. Paul's. As the stroke sounded, the cloud increased, and she saw it darken and spread with extraordinary speed. A turbulent welter of cloud covered the city. All was darkness, all was doubt, all was confusion. The 18th century was over, the 19th had begun. Singling how the Victorian Anthropocene will continue to resonate into the 20th and 21st centuries, Woolf's description of how the climate is still today and imperceptibly alters the constitution of England, influencing everything from clothing to interior decor and even literary style, self-reflexively portrays the interplay of human and non-human agent in the writing of history, and for our interest, the writing of the Victorian Anthropocene. It is clear that Victorian literature was engaged with concern that continue to occupy contemporary ecological discussions. Within Anthropocene studied, it is being increasingly acknowledged that planetary change requires not only a scientific understanding but a cultural, perhaps even an aesthetic explanation. We see this reflected in the way in which Victorian writers were engaged with the fundamental question of human meaning and value at stake in the emergent ecological worldview. As with the dialectical movement in Matthew Arnold's Dover Beach between an oceanic expanse of senseless materiality and the human need for meaning constituted by the tide of faith, the literary history of the Victorian Anthropocene stages the ontological or ontotheological challenges involved in making sense of planetary change. Yet, in foregrounding the precarity of transcendent meaning and acknowledging the specter of nihilism. Arnold's lyric, along with other Victorian literature such as the novels of Thomas Hardy or the poetry of Tennyson, clearly engages with what the eco-critic Timothy Clark has described in Eco-Criticism on the Edge as the fundamental challenge to representation posed by Anthropocene's inhuman planetary scales of space and time. For Clark, who reads Tennyson's portrayal of nature in Tithonus back through the Anthropocene, the tension between human meaning and inhuman materiality speaks to an unsettling and unreducible dissonance between how we make sense of the world and the world itself. In Clark's reading, Tennyson offers little consolation, only an image of human life set against a vast human earth. What emerges from such analysis is that when we read Victorian works such as Tithonus, we are reading work that is at one level engaging with what Timothy Morton has called the ecological thought. Yet, we also find a key difference between Victorian culture and Morton's formulation of an Anthropocene that extends the Victorian period into the present day. For Morton, the Anthropocene means that ontotheological statement about which thing is the most real ecosystem, world, environment, or conversely individual become impossible. In contrast, Victorian literature holds these ontological and theological questions to be unresolved and unresolvable. The body is also focus of Weaver Craig Reid's contribution, Ecologies of Labor, the Anthropocene Body as a Body of Work, foreshadowing his forthcoming book, Primate Change, How the World We Made is Remaking Us. This article provides another significant example of how scholarship of the Victorian period concerning ecology and anthropogenic climate change is creating new knowledge both within academic disciplines and to wider readership beyond. Craig Reid situates the distinctive changes during the Victorian period within much wider historical framework, while also reminding us how, for the first time, such changes to be recorded and circulated in ways technologically impossible during early phases of revolutionary change on the planet. Moreover, the profound changes in how humans worked in and with the environment. In the 19th century were written on the body, Craig Reid argues, citing Victorian sources. Through this autobiography and other example, Craig Reid shows how the environmental crisis that we see presaged in Victorian literature, art, science, and culture is played out on an equally complex canvas, the human body. The relation of the human to the environment is again taken up by Anna Feuerstein in Seeing Animals on Egdon Heath, the democratic impulse of Thomas Hardy's The Return of the Native. Hardy is, of course, another author who has figured prominently in Victorian eco-criticism, but Feuerstein emphasis here is on the significance of animals within the natural environment. Both eco-criticism and animal studies, Feuerstein reminds us, share a desire to move beyond anthropocentric epistemologies, and she argues that Hardy's expansion of representational focus of the realist novel to include animal perspectives pushes political categories beyond the human to imagine how a public can include both human and non-human actants. The Anthropocene intensifies the Victorian provenance of our modern understanding of ecology. The Victorian period saw not only the nascence of modern scientific recognition of the human's entanglement within non-human entities and processes, but aesthetic, ontological, and theological development that accompanied the growing sense of planet as a space of finite resources in which the human is only one species among many. Approaching Victorian literature through the concept of the Anthropocene enables us to thus engage in urgent ecological dialogues across the historical divide between then and now, which instead of shying away from the gap between our present understanding of environmental concern and the Victorian past, embraces it. With this, I conclude the discussion. Let us meet in the next lecture with a new topic. Thank you.